James sat in his tiny off-campus apartment, his laptop open to a half-finished research paper, when his phone buzzed on the desk beside him. He glanced at the screen. His stepmother's name, Linda Carter, flashed across the display. His stomach twisted at the sight. Linda never called him unless it was absolutely necessary. In the years since his father had passed away, their relationship had been nothing short of cold. They rarely spoke beyond forced small talk during family gatherings, and even then she barely looked at him. James hesitated before answering. "Hello." A beat of silence, then Linda's voice, sharp, direct, and laced with something that made his skin crawl. "James, I'm calling to inform you that your trust fund money has been transferred to Emily. She deserves it more than you do." For a moment, James thought he had misheard her. He blinked, gripping the phone tighter. "What?" "I gave the money to Emily," she repeated, as if she were explaining something to a child. "She's proven herself responsible and successful. Unlike you." James felt his pulse spike. "That money was mine. It was in a trust fund set up by my dad for me. You can't just..." "Oh, but I can." Linda cut him off coolly. "I was given control over the fund, and I made a decision. It's done." James shot up from his chair, knocking it back in the process. His heart pounded against his ribs as he struggled to process her words. "This isn't legal," he said, his voice shaking with disbelief. "You can't just take what isn't yours and give it away." Linda scoffed. "Legal or not, it's already been transferred. And honestly, James, you should be thanking me. You waste your time in college with no real plans, no direction. Meanwhile, Emily is building something. She's started her own business. She's engaged. She's taking responsibility for her future. Your father would have wanted the money to go to someone worthy of it." James felt a sharp pang in his chest at the mention of his father. He had died suddenly in a car accident when James was just 16. The loss had devastated him, and in the years that followed, Linda had taken full control of his father's estate. She had assured him at the time that his father had planned for his future, that a trust fund had been set up specifically for him. Now that security was gone. His throat went dry. "Dad wanted me to have that money," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less filled with rage. "Not Emily. Not you." Linda sighed, as if she was growing tired of the conversation. "Your father isn't here, James, and I did what I thought was best. You'll be fine, you're young. Work hard, make something of yourself. Money doesn't just get handed to people who don't deserve it." James was shaking. He had never felt this kind of fury before. His mind raced, trying to think of what to say, what to do. "I will fight this," he said finally. "I'm not letting you get away with this." Linda let out a dry laugh. "Oh, grow up, James. What are you going to do? Hire a lawyer? Go to court? You have nothing. You'd be wasting what little you do have." James opened his mouth to respond, but Linda had already hung up. He stood there, gripping his phone so tightly his fingers ached. His entire world had just been upended in the span of a single phone call. He couldn't believe this was happening. That money wasn't just a convenience for him. It was his future. It was what was going to help him finish school without crippling debt, help him build a life for himself the way his father had planned. And now it was gone. Given to Emily, his stepsister, the perfect golden child in Linda's eyes. James had never harbored deep resentment toward Emily before. They had never been particularly close, but they had coexisted peacefully enough. She was a few years older, ambitious, always excelling in everything she did. Their father had loved them both, but Linda had always treated Emily as superior. Still, James never imagined she would actually accept money that wasn't meant for her. He swallowed hard, his mind spinning. He needed answers. He needed to know how Linda had done this. If she had forged documents, manipulated legal loopholes, or simply lied to get her way. He needed to know if there was any way to undo it. Grabbing his keys, James stormed out of his apartment. There was only one person he could think of who might be able to help him figure this out. His father's old lawyer. And he was going to make damn sure Linda paid for what she had done. James barely slept that night. His mind churned with anger, frustration, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal. He kept replaying Linda's words in his head. "I gave your trust fund to Emily. She deserves it more than you." The audacity of it made his blood boil. He had to find out exactly how she had done it, and more importantly, if there was a way to reverse it. The next morning, he woke up with a pounding headache, but a renewed sense of determination. He needed answers, and the first person who might have them was his father's old lawyer, Henry Wallace. Wallace had handled many of his father's affairs before his sudden death, including the creation of the trust fund that Linda had somehow stolen. If anyone could tell him whether what she did was legal, it was him. James dug through his phone until he found Wallace's contact information. His fingers hovered over the call button for a moment. He hadn't spoken to the man in years. The last time they'd met was during the finalization of his father's estate, when Wallace had assured him that his future was financially secure thanks to the trust fund. Now that security was gone. Taking a deep breath, James pressed call. The phone rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. "This is Henry Wallace." "Mr. Wallace, it's James Carter," he said quickly. "I need your help. It's about my father's trust fund." There was a brief pause before the lawyer responded, his tone cautious but not unfriendly. "James, it's been a while. What's going on?" James exhaled sharply, trying to steady his voice. "Linda called me yesterday. She said she transferred my trust fund money to Emily. She said she had control over it, and made the decision to give it to her instead." He clenched his jaw. "I need to know if that's even legal." Another pause, longer this time. Then Wallace's voice turned serious. "That doesn't sound right at all. Your father was very clear about that trust fund. It was set up specifically for you. I remember handling the paperwork myself." James felt a flicker of hope. So she wasn't supposed to be able to do this? "I can't say for sure without reviewing the documents," Wallace admitted. "If she was named as the trustee, she might have had some level of discretion, but transferring the entire fund to someone else? That's highly questionable." James swallowed hard. "Can I come by your office? I need to figure out how to fix this." "Of course," Wallace said immediately. "Come in this afternoon. Bring anything you have, emails, documents, anything Linda might have sent you about this." James thanked him and hung up, feeling a surge of determination. There was a chance, maybe a small one, but a chance that what Linda had done wasn't legally airtight. And if that was the case, he was going to fight to get back what was rightfully his. A few hours later, James sat across from Wallace in the lawyer's office, a stack of old paperwork in front of them. Wallace flipped through the documents with a sharp eye, his brow furrowing as he scanned each page. "This is interesting," Wallace murmured, tapping one of the documents with his pen. "Your father did name Linda as the trustee, meaning she had control over the fund. But there are restrictions." James leaned forward. "What kind of restrictions?" "She was meant to manage the money for you. The trust clearly states that the funds were to be used for your education, living expenses, and eventually as a financial foundation for your future. There's nothing in here that allows her to transfer the money to someone else." Wallace shook his head. If she moved the money to Emily, she could very well have violated her fiduciary duty. James felt his chest tighten. "So she broke the law?" "It's not that simple," Wallace said carefully. "Trust laws can be complex. If she can argue that she believed transferring the money was in your best interest, or if she manipulated certain legal loopholes, she might try to defend her actions." He sighed. "But at the very least, this warrants an investigation." James clenched his fists. "What do I do?" "You'll need to request full financial records of the trust to see exactly when and how she transferred the money. If there's evidence of misconduct, we can take legal action." James nodded, his mind racing. "How do I get those records?" "Linda's not just going to hand them over. We can start by sending her a formal request," Wallace said. "If she refuses, we may need to file a legal motion to obtain them." He gave James a measured look. "This won't be easy, and it won't be quick." James exhaled sharply. He had expected as much. Linda had always been manipulative, always had a way of twisting things in her favor. But this time, he wouldn't let her get away with it. As he left the office, he pulled out his phone and hesitated for a moment before dialing Emily's number. He didn't know what he expected from her. An admission of guilt? A denial? But he needed to hear her side of this. The call rang a few times before Emily picked up. "James." Her voice sounded hesitant, almost nervous. "We need to talk," James said, keeping his voice as steady as he could. "It's about the trust fund." A beat of silence. Then Emily sighed. "James, I didn't ask for the money." James frowned. "But you took it." Linda told me it was legal, she said quickly. She said it was her decision as the trustee, and that it was better this way. She made it sound like she was doing the right thing. James's grip tightened around the phone. Did you even question it? Another pause. I did, Emily admitted. But Linda said you didn't need the money the way I did. That you'd be fine. James let out a bitter laugh. Unbelievable. So you just went along with it? James, she hesitated. I don't know what you want me to say. I want you to tell me the truth, he said. Did you know the money was never meant for you? Emily sighed again. I didn't know all the details. I trusted Linda. James shook his head. Well, you shouldn't have. Because what she did. It wasn't just unfair. It might not even be legal. Emily went quiet. Then, in a much softer voice, she asked, What are you going to do? I'm going to fight this, James said firmly. And if you really didn't know what was happening, you'll help me fix it. Emily didn't answer right away. I need to think about this. James felt frustration rise in his chest. But he forced himself to stay calm. Fine. But think fast. Because I'm not letting this go. He ended the call and exhaled slowly. Emily might not have been the mastermind behind this, but she had still benefited from it. And if she wasn't willing to help him, he would take Linda down on his own. One way or another, he was getting his money back. James spent the next few days preparing for what he knew would be a brutal fight. His meeting with Wallace had given him a sense of direction, but that didn't make the battle ahead any less daunting. Linda was ruthless, manipulative, and had years of experience twisting the truth to suit her own narrative. If he wanted to win, he needed undeniable proof that she had mismanaged the trust fund. His first step was filing a formal request for the financial records. Wallace drafted a letter demanding full documentation of the trust transactions, specifying that failure to comply could lead to legal consequences. James knew Linda wouldn't hand over the records willingly, but this was the first move in forcing her hand. While waiting for a response, James took it upon himself to gather as much evidence as possible. He dug through old emails, text messages, and paperwork from the years after his father's passing. He found several messages from Linda over the years, vaguely referencing managing the trust and making financial decisions in his best interest. Nothing concrete, but enough to suggest that she had been handling the money without consulting him. Days passed without a word from Linda. Then on the fifth day, Wallace called with an update. She refused, Wallace said bluntly. Said the records are private, and that you have no right to them. James clenched his jaw. So what now? We escalate, Wallace said. We file a formal legal motion to gain access. If she's hiding something, she'll fight this, which will only make her look worse in court. James nodded, though his frustration simmered beneath the surface. He had expected Linda to resist, but it didn't make it any less infuriating. At that moment, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from Emily. Emily, we need to talk. Can you meet me? James hesitated before replying. He still wasn't sure if he could trust her. But if there was even a chance she might be willing to help, he had to take it. An hour later, they met at a small cafe near Emily's apartment. She looked uneasy, fidgeting with the straw in her iced coffee as James sat down across from her. I looked into it, she said without preamble. The money. I asked Linda for details, and she wouldn't give me a straight answer. She glanced at him, her expression uncertain. I think she lied to me. James folded his arms. You're just realizing this now? Emily sighed. I didn't know how much she manipulated things. She made it seem like she had the legal right to move the money, like she was following Dad's wishes. She shook her head. But I checked some paperwork she had in her office. The trust was never supposed to be touched. She transferred the money into an account under my name a few months ago. James sat up straighter. You saw the paperwork? She nodded. I took pictures. James exhaled sharply. This was the break he needed. Emily, this proves she misused the trust. If you come forward with this. Emily hesitated. I don't know.
I'm scared, James.
If I testify against Linda, she'll turn on me. She'll make my life hell. James studied her carefully. You didn't steal the money, Emily. She did. But if you keep it and do nothing, you're just as guilty. She looked away, clearly conflicted. What happens if you win? She asked. Do I have to give it all back? James clenched his fists. It was never yours to begin with. Emily flinched at the harshness in his tone, but she didn't argue. Instead, she slid her phone across the table. Here. The pictures. Use them if you need to. James picked up the phone and scrolled through the images. Bank statements. Transaction records. A letter from the bank confirming the transfer from the trust fund to Emily's personal account. Linda had left a paper trail, one she clearly never expected anyone to find. This helps, James said, meeting Emily's gaze. But I still need you to back me up if this goes to court. She swallowed hard. I'll think about it. James didn't push further. He had what he needed for now. If Emily wasn't ready to take a stand, he would move forward without her. Back at Wallace's office, James handed over the photos. The lawyer examined them carefully, nodding as he went through each image. This is solid evidence, Wallace said. It proves she moved the money improperly. With this, we can file a formal lawsuit against her. James felt a surge of relief. How long will it take? Wallace sighed. It depends. If Linda fights it, which I'm sure she will, this could drag on for months. But with this kind of evidence, we have a strong case. James leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He had expected a long fight, but hearing it confirmed made it feel even more exhausting. Still, he had no choice. This was about more than just money, it was about justice. Over the next few weeks, legal proceedings began. Wallace officially filed the lawsuit, accusing Linda of financial misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. As expected, Linda lawyered up immediately, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing. She painted James as an ungrateful son, trying to milk his father's money, instead of working for his own success. James refused to let her get under his skin. He stuck to the facts, providing every piece of evidence he had. The court granted a motion to subpoena the trust's financial records, forcing Linda to turn over the documents she had previously refused to share. When the records arrived, they only confirmed what James already knew. Linda had moved the money under suspicious circumstances, transferring large sums into private accounts before ultimately handing it over to Emily. The courtroom battle was intense. Linda's lawyers tried to argue that she had acted in the best interest of the family, but the evidence was overwhelming. The judge was particularly unimpressed with Linda's refusal to provide financial transparency. Then, in a surprising turn, Emily finally stepped forward. Midway through the case, she testified that Linda had pressured her into accepting the money and had lied about the legalities of the transfer. Her testimony was the final blow. By the end of the hearings, the judge ruled in James's favor. Linda was ordered to return the full amount from the trust fund, and if she couldn't, she would face further legal consequences. Emily, who still had a significant portion of the money, agreed to return her share voluntarily. As the final ruling was made, James sat in the courtroom, exhaling deeply. The battle had been long, draining, and had irreparably damaged his already fragile family relationships. But he had won, and he would never let anyone take advantage of him again. James sat in the courtroom, barely hearing the judge's final words as the verdict was read. He had won. The ruling was clear. Linda had illegally mismanaged the trust fund, and she was now required to return the money. If she failed to do so, she would face legal consequences, including possible criminal charges for financial misconduct. For a moment, James didn't move. He had spent months fighting for this moment, pouring all his energy into undoing the damage Linda had done. Now that victory was here, he wasn't sure what to feel. Relief, satisfaction, or just exhaustion. Linda sat a few rows ahead, her expression cold and unreadable. She didn't turn to look at him. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she simply nodded stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line. James finally exhaled and leaned back in his seat. It was over. Outside the courthouse, he felt the crisp air hit his face as he stepped onto the street. Emily caught up with him, looking nervous. She had been the last to testify, and her reluctant but truthful words had been the final nail in Linda's coffin. I guess that's it, she said hesitantly. James studied her for a moment. He wanted to be angry at her, for accepting the money in the first place, for not questioning Linda sooner, for only stepping up when the pressure became unbearable. But she had done the right thing in the end. Maybe that was enough. You helped, he admitted. If you hadn't testified, She might have gotten away with it. Emily nodded, looking down at her hands. I should have said something sooner. James didn't argue. She should have. But dwelling on that wouldn't change anything now. What are you going to do now? She asked. James let out a slow breath. That was the question, wasn't it? For so long, all his focus had been on winning this case. He hadn't really thought about what came next. I don't know, he admitted. But I'm not going to let this happen again. I'm going to make sure I never have to rely on someone else to control my future. Emily nodded slowly. I get it. Then after a pause she said, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. James looked at her. And for the first time in months, he believed she meant it. A few weeks later, the financial matters were finalized. Linda, unable to return the full amount immediately, was forced to liquidate some of her own assets to repay the trust. Emily, who still had a portion of the money, willingly transferred it back. James sat in Wallace's office as the final paperwork was signed. The lawyer handed him a folder with a small, satisfied smile. It's officially yours again, Wallace said. No more loopholes. No more trustees. This account is in your name, and yours alone. James took the folder, running his fingers over the cover. It felt surreal. He had spent so much time fighting for this moment. Yet now that it was here, he realized the money itself wasn't what mattered most. It was about control, about making sure no one could ever take advantage of him again. As he walked out of the office, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His thumb hovered over Emily's name. He thought about everything that had happened, the betrayal, the lies, the reluctant reconciliation. Then after a moment he put the phone away. Some wounds needed time to heal. Instead he looked ahead. His future was his again. And for the first time in a long time he felt free.